Well, hey there, friends. I thought we might do something a little different and talk about the Rider-Waite-Smith deck a little bit, which is something I haven't done in a long time. I was working on an essay for my book, and it was about the transition I made from more, um, oh gosh, it's so hard to find the right language, but more esoteric tarot reading to what I'm calling exoteric, or really more day to day, sort of practical, almost even more fortune tellery kinds of readings. Basically, the kind of stuff I've been talking about on my channel for a while, and the kind of stuff I talk about in my book, Tarot on Earth. The transition away from the Golden Dawn associations, etc., and a refocus for myself on the pip decks and older, well, not even older necessarily, just different non-esoteric techniques. But when I was doing that, I started writing in the essay about how really everybody who works with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck or a Rider-Waite-Smith deck descendant is really reading esoteric tarot, whether or not they know it, whether or not they've ever read Waite's books or Crowley's books or anyone connected to the Golden Dawn. If they're working with the images that Pamela Coleman Smith drew, and or those that came after and were inspired by her or are in response to her, then you're really working with esoteric tarot. You're really working with Golden Dawn associations, and it's a really interesting thing. The other interesting thing too is how her art. I honestly can't think of another artist whose work has been copied more than hers. It's such an interesting thing in the art world, right? Because in theory, copying someone's art and revising it slightly would be a no-no, but not in tarot, because of course we're talking about a system of associations. The interesting evolution for me, as just a nerd, is how influential her deck was. The pictures on the cards became the system, not the system that the pictures on the cards were based on. And there is a system, and that's really what we're going to look at today in this video. All of the images, all of the pictures that Pamela Coleman Smith drew of the minor arcana didn't, come from whole cloth. She didn't just make them up. They are based on the esoteric titles of the pips that were given to the Golden Dawn. When I asked on the Reader Studio forum where those esoteric titles came from, and Dan Pelletier from Tarot Garden mentioned that they were really part of the founding documents of the Golden Dawn, what they call the cipher manuscripts. So, not a lot of knowledge of like how those came to be, other than that, as at the moment for me anyway. I imagine that because it's the Golden Dawn, they were based on Kabbalah and astrology, etc. And you can sort of see as you look at the evolution that they Crowley changed things because of astrological associations, etc. So every image that Pamela Coleman Smith drew is a visual interpretation of one of the esoteric titles. And the fascinating thing to me, well, there's a lot of fascinating things to me, and what we're going to look at today is the way her art interprets the title, the source potentially for the esoteric titles, and how even leaving behind the esoteric titles as readers today, we're still influenced by them, although a couple times removed, because we've taken Pamela Coleman Smith's art, which is an interpretation of a system, and we've reinterpreted that system through our own modern lens, our own modern needs, our own modern language, and we've appropriated it in a weird way, But it's interesting to see the line between our modern interpretations and where that all started. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to go through the minors, look at her art, look at the esoteric titles, and we're also going to just sort of do it through a specific lens, right? So we have got Pamela Coleman Smith's art. There she is on the left. We've also got Arthur Edward Waite's writing about the cards, and there he is next to her. He's sort of a handsome devil, that A.E. Waite. We're also going to look at Atea's interpretations for the pips. So really, tarot as a divination system more or less started with Atea, as far as we can tell. But he was basing that on his own knowledge and experience of reading playing cards and other French cartomancy. And he kind of adapted the 36 card deck to tarot. But we'll look at what his keywords were, and there are different translations of his writings. There's different translatings of his words, his keywords. The translations that I'm going to use in this video are from the book A Wicked Pack of Cards. And we'll also look at Crowley's keywords for the card, because those also came from the esoteric titles, because he also came out of the Golden Dawn. But like Waite, he changed things when he wanted to. So that's how we're going to kind of look at these, is through the lens of the art, the esoteric title, but also through the interpretation of these three tarot, forerunners who influenced the version we know today. So so that's kind of a lengthy intro to this, but let's take a look at how we go. So the aces aren't all that interesting. Artistically they're interesting, they're fine, but in terms of evolution, they are what they are. So I'm not going to focus too much on the aces, but the aces all have an esoteric title, rather, of the root of the power of whatever element they are. So the ace is the root of the power of fire. And Atea associated the ace of wands, or the ace of batons, with birth. And you can see what I've done throughout is, wherever Waite, who is really pulling from other systems, wherever he uses either language from the esoteric title, from Atea, or wherever he and Crowley match, I've just put those in bold so we can kind of see. So but let's jump to the cards other than the aces, to kind of go in and see. So here's a card that we often associate. You can see at the bottom of each I've put common modern meanings. These are just things that I've accumulated over time through some research, through some reading, etc. But it's a card, that we associate a lot of the time with prospecting, setting our sights, setting, our early career, goal setting, personal power, etc. But the esoteric title was called the Lord of Dominion, and if you look, it's one of the things I love about looking and comparing the esoteric titles to the image, because if you look at what Pamela Coleman Smith drew, you can see she was writing, or rather drawing, a picture of the Lord of Dominion. You got that really, really aggressively. It's also interesting too to look at the way Waite wrote about the cards. Now, in the text that I've included here, it's right from the pictorial key. I corrected the spelling a little bit just to make it modern in most cases. But so Atea associated this card with sorrow. The esoteric title really has nothing to do with that, Lord of Dominion, and Crowley's keyword is Dominion, so he was pulling right from the esoteric title. Waite, in his description, though, says that it could be sadness, disease, chagrin. So he is connected to Atea there somehow. It's interesting to look at when he is, when he's not. But he also includes the Lord of Dominion, Lord overlooking his dominion. And he doesn't always do that, as we'll see. And part of the reason why, of course, is that esoteric societies, secret societies, are based on secrets. So part of his job was to keep the secrets. But so yeah, you just see, the interesting thing is the way Pamela Coleman Smith drew the Lord of Dominion, and though we're not necessarily calling it that, I think we still get it today. The Lord of Established Strength is the Three of Wands. This is another one where there's a little bit of a connection, in fact, an actual connection between Atea and Waite, not so much between Crowley. Crowley changes things here. But again, if you look at the drawing that Pamela Coleman Smith created, it's definitely established strength. You get that sense. And we don't look at it that way today, because what we're doing is we're interpreting an interpretation. But I think one of the amazing things about Pamela Coleman Smith's art is the way she managed to put into an image something that is so ephemeral, the Lord of Established Strength. How do you draw that? Well, she did. And so some Pamela Coleman Smith defenders might say I'm sort of being disrespectful by pointing out that she didn't invent these images. Of course she invented these images, but they didn't just come out of nowhere. And sometimes they're harder to connect than others. Like this one, The Lord of Perfected Work, not necessarily an easy interpretation, not necessarily an easy link, right? This doesn't really seem to say much about perfected work. But I think, if you've gotten work perfected, you're going to celebrate. So I think it's a pretty interesting interpretation. And here's a place where Waite actually does point to the esoteric title, and really doesn't have a whole lot of connection, again, to Crowley. Atea's social success sort of does. And in a weird way, we still look at the card that way too. The Lord of Strife, pretty straight on. Atea had no connection to what became the Waite Smith or the Golden Dawn interpretation. His word for this was gold. But Waite takes Strife and he makes it a little bit more of a sham, as he says. But again, we're still interpreting today the Lord of Strife. So to me, it's really fascinating. And maybe this is fascinating to you, but look at the Lord of Victory. I mean, her art is victory, like here's one of the clearest. Again, Atea is not super close here. His is domestic. But Crowley and Waite both are interpreting the Golden Dawn esoteric title, and of course, Pamela Coleman Smith serving us that title. Lord of Valor is the Seven of Wands. Pretty close across here. Not, Atea has nothing to do with Valor, but Waite does go to negotiations, which is Atea's keyword here. And I think, you can see Valor may be a little harder to read in this card, but you look at the guy fighting off the sticks, and there is a heroism there. And again, I'm gonna keep repeating myself, but the way that we see Pamela Coleman Smith giving us those titles, it's right there. And so I think it's an interesting thing as anyone who uses this deck to really explore the esoteric titles. The Lord of Swiftness for the Eight of Wands, like, you get it. You may not know that when you look at the card, but once you know it, you're like, yeah, of course, that's what she was doing. Again, interesting here, Atea's keyword for this is country, so he doesn't really have any connection to the Waite Smith or the Golden Dawn. So Atea came first, right? The Golden Dawn came later and based part of their interpretations on Atea. Atea was really ended up being kind of maligned by the esoteric community. They seem to go out of their way to discredit and even emasculate him. Interestingly, there's there are writings that he was a hairdresser. I don't think there's anything shameful about being a hairdresser, but if you think about masculinity, there's sort of a effeminate stereotype throughout history that a man who does women's hair is somehow effeminate. So, but that's not what he was. He was a bookmaker, he was a printer, a publisher, and among other things. So it's interesting that they did try to discredit him while at the same time using his foundation. Nine of Wands is the Lord of Great Strength. Again, Atea here has delay, and Waite does include that. And so, Waite was clearly influenced, but his interpretations weren't entirely the result of Atea. So it's interesting. The Golden Dawn really pulled from where it wanted to and left behind what it didn't like. Lord of Oppression, fairly close, between Crowley and Golden Dawn and Waite here. Atea's keyword was betrayal. But again, you don't necessarily look at this image and see oppression out of the gate. But once you know that's what she's doing, you're sort of like, yeah. So again, the aces, not a whole lot to say about the aces. What's interesting about the ace of hearts or the ace of cups is that Atea's keyword for that was table. And he was really, like I said, he was really basing it on reading with playing cards, which is where cartomancy came from. So the Two of Cups, love, love, love across the board. So pretty traditional there, and we can see what Pamela Coleman Smith was doing. Lord of Abundance. Again, I love the way I look at this card, and I've looked at it for years, and abundance is not a keyword I would have associated with it. But once you know that that's what she was drawing, you see it. And I think it's really cool. And there's a little bit of a relationship between Atea and the Golden Dawn. You know, he was writing about success, or his keyword was success. Everyone else's was abundance, but you get it. Lord of Blended Pleasure. This is the four. This is one of the most interesting ones. Atea's keyword is boredom, which is really how we today interpret this card. If you look at it, sort of apathy or boredom. But the esoteric title is the Lord of Blended Pleasure, which does not necessarily indicate boredom at all. And Crowley changed it to luxury. Waits is interesting, because he gives us boredom, weariness, disgust, aversion. He's giving us an interpretation that really is what Pamela Coleman Smith seems to have been doing, but she was drawing blended pleasure in essence. So it's curious to know why. I'd love to be able to sit down and say, hey, this is supposed to be the Lord of Blended Pleasure. How did this sort of boredom, were you more influenced by Atea here or not? Because that's really, it comes to how we interpret the card today. But Waite also, as a footnote, does include the esoteric title. He says it's also a card of blended pleasure. What does that mean, blended pleasure? It's interesting, but it makes me think of mixed drinks. Lord of Loss and Pleasure. Atea's keyword for this is inheritance, so again, not much connection, but loss and pleasure, that's what she was drawing, and that's what we really got today. We read that card as loss. The Lord of Pleasure is the 6, and Atea's interpretation was the past, but nostalgia is frequently included in meanings for this card, so in a way, we're still reading Atea's meaning here for many folks. And Waite doesn't use the word nostalgia, but he talks about looking back. So the Lord of Pleasure is the esoteric title, but here we actually get more of Waite and Atea connecting. Crowley's keyword for it is just pleasure. The one thing I will say about Crowley's deck, which I've always loved the art, but Crowley himself has always been problematic for me, is the simplicity of his associations for the pips, for the minors. His interpretations of the esoteric titles are actually unusually clear, and the reason that that's interesting to me is because he was not interested in making anything clear to anyone, it seems. So the 7 is the Lord of Illusionary Success. Atea's keyword is thought, and actually Pamela Coleman Smith's image kind of serves us that too, but we do get illusionary success in the card too. So again, it's just really amazing to me how she managed to interpret these. Crowley changed this to debauchery, which in a way you can also see too. This sort of like overabundance of things. 8 is the Lord of Abandoned Success. Atea's keyword for this is blonde girl. And Crowley's was laziness. So really, really disparate meanings here. Waite really gives us... and Pamela Coleman Smith, I think, gives us abandoned success. Again, not necessarily what we would say if we saw it when we see it initially, but looking at it, you can see it. We definitely... And I've heard people interpret the card this way, as leaving behind success in order to go somewhere else. This card is pretty consistent across the board. Lord of Material Happiness. We don't necessarily get material in any of the interpretations, but all of them are here, and you can see it too, so... Same thing with the 10. Perfected success. Waite does use the word perfection. Atea's association is the city. As earlier with the wands, I think we had country. So this is more about location for him. So here we get into swords. Again, the aces, there's not much to say. Atea's interpretation of this was pregnancy. The 2 of Swords, really interesting, right? The Lord of Peace Restored. Atea's keyword was friendship. Crowley's was peace. Waite suggests peace, or a reaffirmed peace, but he doesn't spell it out quite that way. And this is one of the most interesting images, because we don't really today interpret this card in the way that the Golden Dawn would have. We tend to think of this card as choice, being of two minds, being caught in the middle, or about meditation, avoidance, being stuck. I've also heard it referred to as martial arts or similar. So, again, I it's so fascinating to me. Like, I can see what she was doing when I know what she was doing, but we don't necessarily get a clear line to today, and that's sort of where we are. Whereas with the Lord of Sorrow, the 3, it's one of the clearest. Atea's word was separation, but again, you can see a line right from Atea to today, and that's really interesting to me. And Waite never used one word when he could use several, but he gives us a lot. And this is, if you know me, the Suit of Swords is one of the most important to me, because I actually don't like the associations of the Golden Dawn, because I've chosen a different path. You know what I mean? I've chosen a different system to read with. What I need the swords to do is something other than represent a series of unfortunate events, so to speak. So, but you can see it does. There is connection between early cartomancy, at least French cartomancy, and these cards in the Suit of Swords. So, when I tend to say that I've gone to sort of a pre-Golden Dawn approach. That's not entirely true, because the cartomancy that came before was the minors were really based at least slightly on that early cartomancy. What I was gonna do when I was making this slideshow was also include playing card meanings, but they are so wildly diverse, just depending on where you are in the world, and even within countries there's different systems, so I couldn't really find one sort of standard thing that was like the root of all cartomancy meanings, and that's as it should be, right? Because all these systems came from somewhere. So and they largely had to do with the time that they were facing. If you look at Kipper cards or Lenormand cards, you can see that they were really addressing the concerns of the time. Camelia Elias says in one of her blog posts that Lenormand is really addressing the concerns of bourgeois housewives, because those were the people who had the leisure to sit down and lay out cards. So these methods all were so influenced by what was interesting and concerning to the people at the time, and they addressed that, and we're today looking at those things and reinterpreting those interpretations through our own modern needs, our own modern lenses. So anyway, 4 of Swords, I won't belabor that point, but again, you can see a line-ish through Atea to today. But the Lord of Rest from Strife, and rest is a really, really common keyword for this today. So what's interesting, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, is you really can see that Pamela Colman Smith, did what the task was. She gave us those esoteric titles without really telling us what they were, because I bet as you're looking at these, many of your keywords have some connection, even if it's a couple times removed, to the esoteric titles. Lord of Defeat is interesting. I think our modern willful self individualized, actualized society may look at this as actually the opposite of defeat. I think a lot of folks interpret this as success, as beating our enemies, having the upper hand, but the original meaning was defeat, and Atea's word was loss. Lord of Earned Success, here's one that, it's really hard to draw a line between the esoteric title and Pamela Colman Smith's meaning. And in fact, if you look at what Waite had to say, he completely ignores it. He goes right back to Atea. So and Crowley didn't seem to like this one either, because he called this one science. So journey was Atea's keyword. It's Waite's first keyword, and he's very literal here. In fact, we've made it more esoteric, more psychological in modern times by making this about a psychological journey. Lord of Unstable Effort here, Atea's keyword is hope, so not a whole lot of connection, but Waite actually forgot to bold it here, but Waite does use it. So again, he was clearly influenced by Atea when he wanted to be, and often, but not across the board. Also interesting here is that Crowley's keyword is futility, so he does have a difference. But unstable effort comes through to us today frequently as sneakiness, theft, dishonesty, all of which can be unstable efforts. But if you look at what he's doing in this picture, Pamela Coleman Smith was giving us unstable effort. You know, the guy's holding the blades by the sword. He's holding the swords by the blade as he sort of dances away. Lord of Shortened Forest. This is one of my favorites because this is one of the ones that first got me thinking of it. When you look at this picture, obviously we have very modern interpretations being stuck in your mind, being trapped, usually being trapped but able to escape. We really like to point out in modern times that she can get out of those, you know, she's not trapped permanently. We're very self-possessed these days, which is good. But the Lord of Shortened Forest, you can see she's, you know, her force of will has been shortened. She cannot move on. Waite doesn't super traffic in that. He gives us a pretty old-fashioned definition. Now, Atea's is criticism. And let me tell you what, when I get criticized, I feel a lot like this picture, so I can see it. His is all bad news, though. Violence, chagrin, crisis, censure, power, conflict, calumny, sickness. Crowley's keyword was interference, which actually, if you think about it, is closer to shortened force than what Waite gives us. One of the most famous here, Lord of Despair and Cruelty. Atea's keyword was ecclesiastic, so not a whole connection here. You'd think that these more negative associations would come from Atea. They don't. Cruelty came from the Golden Dawn. Crowley gives us cruelty. Waite gives us even further: death, failure, miscarriage, delay, deception, disappointment, and despair. So he really goes for it. You know, by Waite's definition, this is always a bad card. We have interpreted it today as fear, nightmares, anxiety, etc. And then finally, in the swords, the Lord of Ruin, which Atea associated with pregnancy. Again, the two most nasty cards in the minors that we would assume came from Atea don't. His keywords for these two cards are ecclesiastic and pregnancy. So not Atea's fault here. But Crowley and Waite both give us ruin, essentially. Although Waite assures us it's not especially a card of violent death, which probably is prompted by how deadly the image looks. But again, she's giving us ruin, isn't she? You know, there's not much worse it can get. So we get into pentacles now, or coins. These are always interesting too. The esoteric title for the two is Lord of Harmonious Change. Atea gives us embarrassment. Crowley gives us change. Waite goes off in another direction. He says it's a card of gaiety, recreation, also about news and messages, obstacles. So he really doesn't connect to the Golden Dawn or Atea. But we definitely connect to the image today. This is another one of the ones that's sort of difficult to see the line between the esoteric title and her image, but it's there. You know, this is, if you look at the ships moving in the background toward the future, this person's sort of engaging these pentacles in a juggling act. You know, there's change happening here, and it looks pretty harmonious. So we can see what she was doing, and we can see what she was doing here in the Lord of Material Works. Atea's keyword for this is noble. Crowley's was works, and Waite sort of gives us that too, and he specifically talks about skilled labor here, which of course is what she's pictured. But again, you know, the connection between her art and the image and the esoteric titles to me is really interesting. This is a card we've come to associate with greed, but really it didn't have anything to do with that. It was the Lord of Earthly Power. Atea's keyword was a gift. Waite included gifts there. Crowley's keyword was power, and sort of possessions. And greed, cleaving to what one has. We've really taken it further because, of course, we live in a time where we definitely appreciate. You know, we appreciate generosity. In theory, we don't like tyrants. We don't like greed. But you can see this is really a card of earthly power. You can see it in the image. Lord of Material Trouble, boom, you know, not much to say there. Atea's keyword for this was lovers, and Waite refers to that in his meaning, which is interesting because this is not a card that makes you think of lovers, is it? Lord of Material Success. Atea's keyword was the present. Wait, I don't know if this is intentional, but where Atea calls it the present, Wait calls it presents and gifts. So interestingly, interesting today. I think we've interpreted the image through a modern lens, and we've talked about it a lot as charity and inequity. Dilettantes, people who go out and pretend to be charitable but aren't. But in essence, the card isn't really about that, according to the Golden Dawn. It's about material success. Again, we're interpreting an interpretation. And that's why at the beginning when I said we're always reading Esoteric Tarot when we're reading with a deck that was inspired by the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, because we're reacting to the images, but the images were inspired by these. So there's a connection to this. That we're reading the Lord of Material Success, even if we're returning it today as inequity, or charity, you know what I mean? We're being influenced by that just because we're being influenced by the image, which is why it's so interesting to me to see where the ideas came from. Here's another one that's interesting, because I think a lot of times we have a fairly modern, positive approach to this card, this sort of reap what you sow, harvesting your work, your labor, and you can see that in the card, but you can also see the Lord of Success unfulfilled. It's all about failure, really. In essence, Waite doesn't super go into that, and Atea's definition is a little bit of money, which is sort of a very Kipper kind of card meaning. But if you look at the guy, he's not super happy, and I think she's giving us the Lord of Success unfulfilled. You can work really hard and wind up with a shrub full of pentacles that don't really add up to much, So again, we don't interpret the card this way, but it's fun to look at the image and see what she was doing and say, oh yeah, that guy's not super happy if you look at his face. So there's some success unfulfilled there. The Lord of Prudence is card 8, and Atea's association was Dark Girl as opposed to Blonde Girl from earlier. Crowley's keyword was Prudence. Waite, I think we have a pretty, we are drawing a line today right from the beginning to Waite here. Work, employment, commission, craftsmanship, etc. This is an interesting one. I put this little arrow on the screen for Waite's keyword of Prudence because that was actually the esoteric title of the previous card, but he calls this Prudence. But this is the Lord of Material Gain. Atea's keyword was Bill of Goods. Crowley's keyword was Gain. So Waite here doesn't really give us material gain, but Pamela Coleman Smith's image sort of does. This is one of my favorite cards in the whole Waite Smith. I just love this. But it's interesting because our modern interpretations tend to be about experience, maturity, introversion, wisdom, but material gain is really what it's about, and I just kind of think that's interesting. And then finally, the Lord of Wealth. Atea's keyword for this is tears, so again, we're not getting connected, but Waite gives us gain and riches, family matters, and we still sort of view this as family today, old age, maturity, roots, and lineage. So that is just a really interesting, to me, look at the evolution of the esoteric titles and Pamela Coleman Smith's images, and how today we are still reading those titles just in a different language. The language is still there because that's what Pamela Coleman Smith was working with, but she interpreted that into a picture, and now we're interpreting her pictures, and the evolution of that, the process of that is really fascinating to me. And being able to kind of draw a line between the original, quote, the original Golden Dawn meanings and our current meanings is really fascinating. Now, of course, by current meanings, I've generalized. Everyone has different associations. But one of the interesting things, too, that I think a lot about is how every deck influenced by the Waite-Smith deck is really in conversation with the Waite-Smith deck. It's often a reaction to it. We've got neo-pagan iterations. I think of like the Robin Wood, for example, is a sort of pagan, witchy, Celtic, earth-based religion reaction to the Christian iconography in the Waite-Smith deck, but it's still a reaction to it, and it's still influenced by it. And the trumps, the majors, there's actually less variation, even as they get retitled. But people, when people are interpreting as artists, the minors, what they're usually doing is interpreting Pamela Coleman Smith's image, and reacting to it and saying, this is what either I accept what she did or I think she should have done it this way. This is what she meant or this is what she should have meant. And so everything is sort of in dialogue with it. So in many, many ways, I think, I've said this before, I can't remember where, but I can't think of a more influential work of art than this one, even though it's in our tiny tarot microcosm. Can you think of any painting or set of paintings that has been copied and reacted to and recolored and reshaped and reprinted in more ways than this one? I can't think of anything, from a visual art standpoint. So pretty amazing. And also amazing is her talent, Pamela Coleman Smith's talent, at taking these very esoteric, very difficult, very strange, often titles with these lofty sounding names and making them approachable and making them available to us today, making them available to an audience of readers, and making them make sense to everyday life, which is really what the pips do, which is what the minors really do. So sort of genius, when you think about it, how skilled it is, especially given how quickly she did it. And speed sometimes is beneficial, right? Because you don't have time to overthink. So I think there's something in that too. She didn't have time to overthink, so she just went for it. And I love that. So Pamela Coleman Smith, genius, and looking at the source is also really interesting. So here we go. Here's just a sort of half-hour nerdy journey into some tarot anthropology. I hope this was interesting, and I hope you're doing well. Be good.